parenthood is all joy and no fun. It's hard to think of anything that is more counter to a sort of hedonistic consumerist culture than parenting, because hedonism is all about front-loading the short-term pleasure, even though we know that pleasure fades quite quickly. Whereas parenting is all about front-loading effort, and particularly in the case of the mother, pain and discomfort and everything, for the sake of a very long-term source of meaning and satisfaction. So it makes sense that parenthood is not really considered to be an essential part of the good life.
The irony of that, of course, is in terms of demographics, most Western cultures are going to face a situation where people who have lived this lifestyle will get to old age and find there isn't the tax base, there aren't the workers, there isn't the infrastructure to keep them in the very comfort to which they've been so addicted.
Yeah.
It's a strange irony that people
Yes.
don't think these things through.
Yeah. This is the subject of my next book, actually. I'm writing a book called The Case for Having Kids, which is sort of about the flip side of this, right? So if the first book was about the effects on sexual culture of the pill severing sex from reproduction, then this is the other side of it. The fact that now that it is so much easier to not have children, because you can have sex without getting pregnant, so many people are choosing to do that. I mean, the cause of plummeting birth rates is a source of great debate, because it's easy to it's quite easy to be parochial about it and say, I mean, like a common thing that I'll hear among my friends in London, for instance, is, oh, it's because house prices are too high, so people can't afford to have children. And it's like, yes, house prices are very high, and it probably is a disincentive for some people. But this is happening everywhere. So only about 3% of the world's population live in a country where the birth rate is not falling. Some countries have much lower birth rates even than us. So South Korea is currently the out in front by some distance, and
the Japanese, the Chinese, the Northern Italians.
Yes,
It's extraordinary. Even
yes.
Bangladesh has a falling population.
It's amazing, yeah. There seems to be something about modernity that causes this. As soon as countries, and the sort of income threshold is not even necessarily that high. It's not even that you have to be really affluent in order to start on this declining birth rates trajectory. Now, as you say, Bangladesh, places like that, people aren't very rich, but they're already in this second demographic transition. It seems to be something to do with people becoming modern, particularly becoming urbanized, and spending less time. One definition of modernity, which I find very interesting and attractive, is it's essentially defined as spending more time with strangers than with people you're related to. Because in traditional cultures, you spend basically all your time. I mean, hunter-gatherer kind of tribes, you're basically constantly surrounded by your extended kin network. And then as people migrate away from rural areas, live increasingly atomized lives, many people will hardly ever see their families. They'll spend almost all of their time with people they're not related to. And that seems to be very strongly linked with falling birth rates. We can speculate on the connection there, but it does seem to be a very, very strong one. And yes, as you say, the current, the affluence currently available to modern Westerners, the welfare state pensions, socialised healthcare, all of this, I would be enormously surprised if I ever receive a state pension. Because I think by the time probably in the UK, I would guess probably about the 2040s is when we're likely to see really significant collapsing of these kind of public services, because that's when the baby boomers are going to pass away, and they were the last above replacement generation. But the whole system is a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. People haven't realised it.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Mind you, they have in Beijing. They're desperately trying everything they can to get the birth rate up, and it's not happening.
Yeah, well, because that's what that's what the Chinese are discovering to their cost. That
irony.
It's quite easy to lower birth rates.
Yeah.
The one-child policy was pretty successful, obviously incredibly coercive, but it worked. Whereas trying to move them in the other direction doesn't seem to be possible.
It always seems fascinating to me that I can't see any great concern on the part of feminists. But the other part of the equation there is the massive disappearance of vast numbers of female babies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some feminists do talk about it, but it's a tricky one because if you're going to be radically pro-choice, I mean, there are lots of arguments that you could make in defense of having some forms of legalized abortion, right? But if you're going to have a complete if you're going to argue for it from a position of radical autonomy, the fetus has no personhood, etc., it's quite hard to square that with them thinking that female fetuses being aborted are having some kind of harm done to them, which is, I think, why that source of dissonance people tend not to look at.
Quite telling, though. It's almost opening up a whole new sort of range of issues. But what's happening in the sort of the psychology of the West? Prosperous, you've mentioned house pricing, but basically Western societies that enjoy high living standards even today. What's happening in the minds of people that they're not attracted to having children and they're not, and nowhere near as concerned as I believe they ought to be in ensuring that the child is nurtured appropriately?
It's funny, isn't it? That
letting them be victims of the culture battles that are going on.
We've never been safer, we've never been more comfortable, and yet it is not uncommon to hear young people saying something like, oh, how could I bring a child into this world and sort of subject them to the horrors of the world, particularly when it comes to, for instance, climate change. And I think our ancestors brought children into the world with the expectation that half of them would die before they turned 5, you know, with constant threat of famine, of war, of all of these things, which we fortunately just essentially don't really think about. I mean, I'm sure that part of what is going on with people who say they don't want to have children because of climate change is it is sometimes more palatable to tell oneself that story or to tell other people that story that you're doing this for virtuous reasons, rather than to say, well, I don't want to take the hit to my lifestyle, you know, which is often a big part of what's going on. It is true that it will take a hit to your lifestyle, having a child, it will, because, I mean, a lot of this is to do with the fact that we are now, all of society is set up on the expectation of 2 incomes. And a big part of the reason why houses are incredibly unaffordable if you have children, if you have just either you're paying childcare costs or because you have a stay-at-home parent and another breadwinner, is because you're competing against people who have 2 incomes and no children, right? So it is true that it'll take a hit to your lifestyle. That obviously doesn't sound as nice as saying, well, I'm doing it in this sort of valiant effort to protect the planet. But I think it is also combined with a very sincere sort of loss of confidence among Westerners. I mean, we see this elsewhere in all the culture war battles, a feeling that there's something kind of, something sick, something bad about the West. A real lack of, a real loss of faith in everything really, in the whole civilization. And particularly, of course, when it comes to loss of religious faith. It was funny watching the coronation to see this very rare example of the old establishment. It felt almost a little bit like a last hurrah, you know, like obviously it is the coronation is an explicitly Christian ceremony. It feels deeply medieval in large parts of it, despite the efforts to sort of inject some modern elements into it. It still felt deeply Christian too, you know, but it felt almost like the ghost of the past watching it, because this is now so much less prized than it once was. And maybe it's just very difficult for people who basically don't have any, who basically despise their ancestors, to want to invest in the future, to want to, you know, make the enormous personal sacrifices that you do have to make in order to have children. Yeah, it's amazing. It's like a collective suicide.
It is, well,
Yeah, at our most affluent, our most comfortable, our safest period in history, and everyone decides all of a sudden to commit collective suicide. It's very strange human behaviour, isn't it?
I have a very good friend who is one of the world, actually, is leading heart-lung specialists. And he writes extensively about the importance, actually, of fathers being involved with their children's lives. But that's incidental. I asked him why he's doing that, and he said, at the time that I asked him, he said, I've had to tell about 300 men, there's nothing more we can do, you are going to die. And he said, all 300 have had as their first response something along the lines of, I wish I'd spent more time with my family and children.